The rain was pounding when the colonel stepped out, locked eyes with the drenched stranger, and snapped into a salute. Gasps echoed as every cadet froze, some dropping their phones mid-recording. The man they mocked was a legend they'd been trained to revere. But what happened next will shock even those who thought they'd seen everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. The wind hissed through the pine trees that lined the perimeter of Jefferson Military Academy, carrying with it the sour metallic scent of soaked asphalt and gun oil. Rain didn't fall so much as it attacked, smearing the horizon in gray strokes, blurring the once sharp edges of the academy's granite walls. Beyond those walls, cadets in freshly pressed uniforms moved in staggered columns toward morning formation, boots splashing through puddles without breaking stride. Some muttered curses, some laughed. Most glanced once at the man standing outside the gate, and didn't look again. He stood like an artifact from another war. The stranger's coat, oversized and stained with time, hung heavy on his frame. His boots, scuffed raw at the toe, were planted in the mud as though roots held him there. Water poured from the brim of his cap, forming thin rivulets that traced down weathered cheeks and vanished into the salt and pepper scruff of his jaw. His eyes, pale and steady, were fixed on the flag, raised high and snapping violently in the wind, like a compass needle frozen on one true direction. He didn't shiver. He didn't blink. The cadets noticed that too. A group of seniors, cocky, caffeinated, and too young to know shame, slowed as they passed. "Bet he's been standing there since last night," one snorted. "Poor bastard's lost in time," another added. "Think he even knows where he is?" Someone laughed, loudly, cruelly, but the man never turned his head, not once. They couldn't see the white scar that crept from beneath his collar up the side of his neck. They couldn't read the story in the way his hands curled slightly inward, fingers trained to trigger pull long past rest. They didn't recognize the stance, the quiet gravity of someone who had stood at attention in places where silence came only after fire and blood. To them, he was nothing, a drifter, a ghost. And yet he remained, in that storm, in that exact spot, unflinching, waiting, not for charity or help, but something deeper, the kind of waiting that is not about time, but about place, as though the ground beneath him remembered him even if the people didn't. And as the rain fell harder, the line between dignity and delusion blurred for those who dared to watch, but not for him. He had never been more certain of anything in his life. The warmth inside the front office clung to Lieutenant Adam Vaughn like a second skin, a skin he had no intention of shedding. The thermostats were set 2 degrees above regulation. The floors shined like surgical steel. The leather chair behind his desk never creaked, and neither did his staff. Vaughn demanded order not just as a standard, but as a personal creed. Anything that threatened the antiseptic symmetry of his world was an irritant to be removed, preferably before it could breathe twice. He sipped his coffee, extra vanilla creamer, 1 sugar, from a ceramic mug he'd bought for himself last Christmas. Best boss ever. A joke, perhaps, but one no cadet dared challenge. His eyes drifted to the bank of security monitors mounted behind his desk. 4 screens displayed live feeds from the academy's perimeter. 3 showed nothing but wind-blown trees. The 4th showed him. That man. Still there. Still standing. Rain now sluiced from the man's shoulders like runoff from a worn statue. Vaughn narrowed his eyes. The figure hadn't moved in over 45 minutes. That alone was suspicious. Disturbing, even. Vaughn didn't deal in gray areas, only threats and compliance. He stood with swift precision, straightened his collar, and tugged his tailored uniform tight against his ribs. The ceremonial saber at his hip wasn't standard for that day's duty roster, but he wore it anyway. He liked how it looked when he walked. The umbrella opened with a sharp snap as Vaughn marched down the stone steps and across the puddled courtyard. Rain pattered harmlessly off the synthetic canopy above his head. His boots left no prints. No sound, but purpose. The man was still watching the flag. "Sir," Vaughn called, his voice hard and clipped. "You can't loiter here. I'm going to have to ask you to leave the premises immediately." No response. The man didn't even flinch. "I said," Vaughn's tone lifted, face twitching, "you need to leave. Now." Still nothing. From the barracks windows across the quad, cadets leaned against glass panes, their curiosity sharpened by boredom and hierarchy. Some recorded on their phones, the silent kind of insubordination that travels farther than words. A tall cadet in Delta Company smirked. "Vaughn's gonna blow a gasket," he said under his breath. He wasn't wrong. Vaughn's ears flushed red. His nostrils flared. The umbrella dipped for a moment as his hand twitched toward his radio. "Security!" he barked into the device. "Get this lunatic off the property immediately!" But even as he spoke, a subtle unease crept up Vaughn's spine, like the kind that lingers in the air just before lightning splits the sky. The hallway lights buzzed overhead, casting sterile pools of fluorescence across the polished tile floor. The air in Jefferson's administrative wing always smelled faintly of industrial lemon cleaner and starch. Hygienic, efficient, dead. But to Sergeant Kyle Boone, the place always felt hollow, like a museum that had forgotten what its artifacts meant. He had served, really served. Not in some simulation chamber or command post behind a desk, but in the jagged sand and smoke-choked alleys of Fallujah and Ramadi. He knew the difference between men who played soldier and men who bled in silence. Boone stood by the supply cabinet, reviewing marksmanship reports with a red pen clenched between thick, calloused fingers. The paper was damp at the edges. He never bothered with folders. That was Vaughn's style. Pretty, useless. Then he heard it. Raised voices, a flash of static from a two-way, and a name that wasn't spoken but spit. Lunatic. He looked up. Out the narrow corridor window, distorted by streaks of rain, Boone saw a figure. Not just any figure. That figure. The kind of shape that drills itself into the bones of your memory so deeply, even trauma can't shake it loose. He dropped the clipboard. Pages scattered across the floor like dry leaves. His boots moved before his brain caught up. The hallway lengthened in his mind as he strode fast, then faster, until it became a full sprint. His heartbeat wasn't rising from the exertion. It rose from something ancient and immediate. Recognition, awe, and a sudden fear that others wouldn't understand what he did. His breath came short as he rounded the corner toward the colonel's office, nearly slipping on the waxed tile. The framed unit citations along the wall blurred in his peripheral vision. He'd helped earn some of those. But none of them mattered now, because if he was right, everything was about to change. He didn't knock. He couldn't. Not when the image behind that rain-streaked glass still burned into his retinas. His voice, always gravel-thick, broke on impact. "Colonel, sir, you need to come. Right now." Delaney looked up from a monitor, confused. Calm. Boone's eyes were wide, face pale beneath the bristle of gray in his beard. For a moment, he looked like a man who had seen a ghost, and in a voice barely above a breath, he said the name. "It's Maddox." Colonel Frank Delaney didn't do interruptions. The man was a master of discipline, the type who could deliver a tongue-lashing without raising his voice. His uniform, always immaculate, seemed pressed even when he sat, and his clipped, precise speech had made more than one junior officer wilt. At that moment, he was deep into a Zoom call with Washington brass, arguing down a line item about drone maintenance logistics when Sergeant Boone crashed through his office door like a breach charge. Delaney's frown was immediate and sharp. "Boone? What?" But the words that followed pierced through the sterile rhythm of admin speak like a round through glass. "It's him. Sir. It's Commander Travis Maddox." Delaney didn't blink, didn't breathe. The silence that followed was vast. Even the crackling voice on the other end of the call faded into irrelevance. For a moment, the colonel stared at Boone as if waiting for the punchline to a cruel joke. But Boone's jaw was set. His eyes didn't waver. "You're sure?" Delaney asked, though his voice had lost all the stiffness it usually carried. Boone nodded once. Delaney rose. Not quickly, reverently. He adjusted his cover with practiced fingers, but they shook ever so slightly, just enough to betray the earthquake moving through his chest. Then he straightened, shoulders back, and strode from the room without another word. The double doors flung open to a theater of wet chaos. Rain came down like war drums now, hammering the quad. Cadets clustered at the windows, a half-dozen cell phones recording. And there, just past the steps, Lieutenant Vaughn stood fuming, barking orders at a man who had not moved a muscle since the storm began. "Last warning before I—" "Lieutenant!" The voice that cut through the courtyard was not loud, but it was final. The kind of voice that ended conversations, careers, and wars with a single syllable. Vaughn turned slowly, confusion warping into dread as Colonel Delaney approached, Boone just behind him. Delaney didn't glance at his subordinate. His eyes were locked on the figure standing in the rain. Then he did something no cadet had ever seen him do. He halted, drew himself to attention, and raised his hand in a crisp textbook salute. "Commander Maddox," he said, his voice firm, full of something between reverence and grief. "Welcome home, sir." Time stopped. Phones slipped from stunned fingers. Jaws went slack. Laughter died in throats, leaving only the sound of wind and water. And suddenly, the soaked figure was no longer a stranger. He was the storm. There had been a time when the name Travis Maddox carried weight in war rooms and whispers alike. His leadership of the 7th Recon Division was the stuff of field legend, whispers traded between green recruits and seasoned grunts alike, always in the tones reserved for men who had bled beside ghosts. Maddox didn't just lead missions. He went where other commanders refused, into black zones marked with nothing but grid coordinates and the word classified. And he brought his men back. Not always whole, not always the same, but alive. For that alone, they would have followed him into hell without question. His medals, 6 of them, gleaming pieces of nation-sanctioned valor, had sat for a time in a box in his former home. He never mounted them, never spoke of them. Valor, he once said to a young lieutenant under his command, was just what you did when retreat wasn't an option and rescue wasn't coming. Praise meant little when you buried your best friend with his wedding ring still in your pocket. The day it ended was a routine patrol outside Kandahar, a road they'd driven dozens of times. The IED was clever, old-school Soviet tech, repurposed and buried beneath a makeshift decoy. It didn't just detonate. It tore. Metal, skin, memory. Maddox was thrown 30 feet and didn't wake for 7 months. When he did, there were wires instead of veins and a silence in his mind where names used to be. He refused a hero's discharge ceremony, refused the honorary doctorate, refused every Sunday interview and cable news special. "I'm not a story," he told the VA therapist. "I'm just what's left." And then he vanished. No forwarding address, no social media, not even a gravesite-style disappearance, just a name that faded like smoke through the halls of command. Until now. No one understood why he came back to Jefferson. But Boone would later guess it wasn't about nostalgia. It was about duty. This place had once been his forge, the final ground where boys became soldiers under his eye. And now, years later, he had returned not to claim anything, but to stand, to feel the flag snap above him once more, to remember what it had all meant when meaning still had weight. And they laughed at him, because they didn't recognize the silence. They didn't understand that some men don't speak unless spoken to by history itself. The rain hadn't stopped, but no one dared call off the formation. The sky wept cold and relentless over Jefferson Academy, yet the cadets stood rooted in place, shoulders squared, spines straight, uniforms soaked through until the dark wool clung to their skin like pennants. No one moved. No one spoke. Not a single boot shifted on the flooded walkway. The silence was not mandated. It was earned. Lieutenant Vaughn's desk sat untouched inside the admin wing, the chair turned slightly as if vacated in haste. The "Best Boss Ever" mug had been left on the windowsill, now half filled with rainwater from a cracked pane. No one had asked where he went, and no one planned to. Inside the old stone chapel, the air was heavy with the scent of wet fabric, floor polish, and solemnity. The cadets who had laughed were now among the first row, hats in hand, rainwater trailing from their cuffs. They stared ahead, jaws clenched not in defiance, but in something far more painful: remorse. Commander Travis Maddox stood before them, not at a podium, not behind glass, but in the open aisle between their seats. His silence was thunder, his presence a monument. Colonel Delaney stood beside him, holding a box draped in navy blue velvet. With measured care, he lifted from it a refurbished officer's jacket, clean, pressed, and gleaming with insignia Maddox had once worn into battle. The rank was stitched exactly as it had been on his last tour. Nothing added, nothing taken. Delaney turned to face the cadets, and his voice, never prone to flourish, carried like a drumbeat through the pews. "We train young men to fight," he said, pausing to let the rain tapping against the stained glass settle into rhythm. "But we must also teach them how to recognize a warrior." He held the jacket out. Maddox accepted it without a word, sliding his arms into sleeves that once bore the weight of command. For a moment, the room seemed to breathe in unison, as though witnessing something sacred. A man reclaimed, not by ceremony, but by acknowledgement. A week later, a bronze plaque was drilled into the stone wall beside the academy's front gate. It bore no title, no military jargon, just a single inscription: "In honor of Commander Travis Maddox, who stood tall when others forgot." And the cadets who once snickered at a ghost in the rain? They stood taller after that day, straighter, quieter. Because some lessons don't come from lectures, they come from silence and the man who endured it.